Hi Lizzie.
How are you?
I'm fine, Lizzie. How are you? We're getting out of the lockdown.
Yes.
And I think everybody's excited.
Yeah, very. And it's sunny outside, and people are like, life, it's back. Good. Let's try to do. Try our best to be happy.
Yeah.
No, it's good.
I'll join you.
Yes, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about Wolf, about this piece. It has been made in 2003.
Yes.
So it's 18 years old. So that's quite a long time ago.
It looks like before World War II.
Yeah?
It's so long.
Yeah, it's very long, yeah.
Yeah. But let's freshen it up.
Let's freshen it up. From my experience in that piece, I pick up this one. Also because it was quite revealing for me in many aspects. And also because I had a question, but I'm going to go in order. But like, for example, but maybe it had happened to you already, when you came on stage after the show and people were booing in the Opera de Paris. And that stayed with me as a very strong memory about how would you feeling, when you came on stage. What is that feeling like?
What is that feeling? When I see the piece back now, or images of the piece, I can really understand that people were pissed off, or that they didn't understand, or that it was chaotic, all these things. And when I look back to it, I also see that it's like the ending of a period. Wolf, it's the period where, until then, I was using personal information from the dancers, and especially their social cultural contexts of where they came from, and used it as information to make the piece about. And so you get a lot of different information in the performance, all brought together around this music of Mozart, but it's very eclectic and very scattered as information. And I can imagine that people who were used to see dance performances in which things were clean and beautiful and synchron and together and whatever, that it was like too much, This, together with the fact that there were dogs on the stage, that make it even more chaotic, or made it even more chaotic, and some of them peed and shit on stage, or they fucked with each other on stage. It must have been, especially in the context of the Opera of Paris, quite provocative, So in that sense, I could understand that people were very, very angry, some of them, and others saw it as like a breakthrough of something, to bring the street literally on stage must be, for some of them, also very opening doors. So I can understand the controversy of the performance. But how do I feel? If there's one thing I don't want to, is to shock people, or to make them angry or something like that. Which doesn't mean that I want to please an audience. And so if I allow certain images to be shown on stage, it's because I feel uncomfortable with them also. So I feel very, very close to what people who see the performance are feeling, and in that sense, I would be upset too. But if they boo and are angry, it doesn't make me feel happy or something. It's okay if they feel uncomfortable or puzzled or want to know more or question about lots of things. That's nice. But to be angry, that makes me sad, really. So you see, I can understand lots of their emotions, but at the same time, I don't want them to feel angry or to boo or something like that. I like it when people, after the performance, if they are angry, they come to me and try to understand why we make this. So it's a long answer to say I feel uncomfortable when people boo.
And you think it relates, like how you take life and art, it relates for them in some kind of way, or to you, like like you take life, like for example with Wolf, it is relating somewhere in your life, the period you were living then, the piece
Absolutely,
itself.
yeah. But as I said, it's like the end of a period in which I used quite personal information from the performers, and personal, which is for me linked in that period to a social and cultural context of where they come from. Like if they come from Africa, or if they come, these things were quite important. And I can see that after that, when we started to work on Vespers, and then all the pieces after that, the information that was brought in from the performers in the piece were much more coming from deep inside, not superficial, not like I'm Jewish or I am African or I am colored or not colored. But from then on, from Vespers on, the information came from deeper, And in that sense, for me, Wolf is like a breaking point.
And in this sense, like for example, this controversial thing that happened with the flags, all these things, would you? I mean, we talked about it, but would you do it again? And like after all what happened, because I remember in one moment you were a bit disappointed that people were giving so much attention to that scene, then they don't look at the piece as a total, but in like taking it in your artistic way, parkour, would you do again something, then maybe people won't look at the piece as a total, only at one specific scene, for example?
Well, from the beginning, I was very sensitive to what people were discussing in the studio when they came to rehearse, Not only, as I said, their personal information, the personal engagement, and what they wanted to bring in the performance was important, but also what they discussed about. And very often that is, or these are things that are happening in the world. And either you can decide as a director to keep it out of the performance. What happens in the world is what is happening in the world. We are focused on making art or something like that. Or you can try to look for ways to let it enter in the performance. And I think until Wolf, very literal things of what was happening in the world were also seen in the performance. And in Wolf it was quite extreme in that sense that we brought in this idea of nationalistic thinking, or nationalism, things that were, in my opinion, growing in those days. We cannot imagine that it was not existing or barely existing before, because nowadays it's crucial important. But in the beginning of 2000, 2001, 2002, when we started to think about bringing in flags in the performance, I remember that some colleagues were saying to me, like, what are you talking about? Nationalism, that's gone. We are becoming part of a bigger world. Europe was becoming like a powerful entity, and maybe flags were going to disappear. But I could feel in Belgium in particular, but also in the world, that there were nationalistic parties that were growing and taking more and more place in societies. So I was very worried about that. And in those days, I'm talking about 2002, 2003, we had the war in Iraq, and a very powerful and authoritarian, very powerful figures in the world, and especially in America, we had Bush, who was taking decisions that were going against, what people were thinking in the world. Like instead of going away from wars, he was provoking wars, and he took decisions against lots of other countries, and that provoked a lot of anger in the world. The invasion in Iraq was something that caused a lot of anger. And in those days also there was in Israel more and more a very harsh policy against Palestinians, more and more. This whole idea of trying to live together, or even trying to make two states, was put in danger in those days. So to show our disagreement about these nationalistic feelings. We had this idea of bringing in flags and showing that we disagreed about that and so on, and it culminated in some sort of a chaotic scene in which two flags were burned, and that indeed caused a lot of reactions. Maybe in those days less than we in general expected, because if you would do it nowadays, I think it would really cause even more problems. I think you would be brought to court.
To
for
court,
that.
yeah.
But when we decided to do that, I remember we discussed a lot about it, and there was some sort of agreement, and we discussed between each other who took this decision or who had the power to say we do it or we don't do it, and I take full responsibility for that. But I felt supported by the team that I was working with. So to do it, to burn those two flags on stage, was a very strong statement, and a statement that I still am backing. It's something that I really believe in, like to show on stage the burning of flags as a metaphor to talk about, let's burn all the flags, let's just forget about these nationalistic feelings, let's try to become humans without living in countries and with borders and these things. A very naive way of thinking, but in those days I can remember that I believed that maybe this would be possible. Nowadays I doubt about it even more than in those days. So okay, we did it. And I still I'm standing behind this decision, but I don't know if I could be able to convince people on stage to do that. And when we talked about it last, 2 weeks ago, I could also feel what kind of grief it caused for you personally. Things that I was not confronted with, that had to do with your personal situation. And I don't know if I would try to convince you to do that again. And probably you wouldn't do it again. So it's
I would think more about it, more longer period.
Yeah. So it shows, even though it looks like yesterday, you can feel that there is a history of 17 years, 18 years that has passed since. And in this period, so many things changed. In the world, politically, but also on a personal level, that if I would do it again, I would take much more time and much more care in discussing with the people who would do that on stage. Yeah.
And regarding this piece, for you that was the core of the piece, that scene was the core of the piece, like not a favorite, but something which, then without it, the piece wouldn't have existed, or without that scene of the flags?
No, I don't think so. I think we would have found other things. No, it's something, for me, that still is very important to talk about on stage. But, and in those days, that was really like the strongest image that we could find. But nowadays, if I would be confronted with objections against it, or people who would feel very uncomfortable to do it, or with, for example, protests coming from the audience, I would reconsider it. I can't give an answer on what would be the alternative for the moment, because it's something I would have to figure out with the people I work with.
But when you say like you don't want to be provocative, but you still put it, how does it work for you? Like you don't want to be provocative, but you still put provocative things on stage consciously, yeah?
Yeah, because I don't want to treat an audience like they are children or something, or that they are not able to cope with certain images. I want to confront the audience with images that make me uncomfortable also. So when I decide to put certain images on stage, it's not because I'm standing above them, as I would say. Like if that I'm comfortable with that. I want to, I'm not afraid to put images on stage that make me uncomfortable and that make an audience uncomfortable, because you know, people when they go to see performances, they want to live a very strong experience, that's for sure. And if that means that very uncomfortable images or statements are being proposed on stage, I think that's fine. Absolutely, that is fine. But the most important thing for me is that when we decide to put these images on stage, then I want to be sure that people who are doing that on stage feel absolutely comfortable to do that. And I had the impression in those days that everybody, even though with the controversy of the audience, felt okay with that. But I'm not sure if people now would feel comfortable to do that. So it would be another kind of dialogue with the people I work with. But we touch something that I find extrememe important, because I have the impression that nowadays so many things are not allowed anymore to show on stage. And there is one thing. One thing is, how do you work with people, and how do you use your power as a director, and how do you communicate with your cast on how to bring certain images on stage. That's one thing. The other thing is, what is censored nowadays? What can we not show anymore because of reasons that are coming from outside the work, you know? Nowadays you have to take care on how you present women, on how people are represented on stage, you know, if the cast is diverse enough, if you are playing something that you are not, that is something that is questionable nowadays. Certain images, like for example, if we take the burning of flags, I don't know if this would be still allowed to do on stage. You know, we have had this whole controversy about blackfacing and these things, so there are lots of things that are certain things about sexuality, how children are represented on stage. You know, these things, it's a lot of information, are questioned nowadays. And I think it's a good thing, but I'm afraid also that it brings people who are creating things sometimes in a situation that they are more or less paralyzed in terms of, you know, we shouldn't do that, no, we cannot show that. This is something, I think 20 years ago, was not the case.
And who is dictating this? Why this trend, let's say?
Well, I think for sure people who feel that they are victim of something. You know, women, to give us one example, but it's one of or maybe the most clear example. Women who have been abused, for example, do not want to see women who are abused on stage. Even if you want to explain something with that, I think it is not something that you can show on stage anymore for the right reasons, I think, for sure. But this is you know, this is shifting the whole time, and it goes into, sometimes it's, you know, sometimes you come into situations where it really becomes very ambiguous and trivial. Like for example, there's a group of a theater performance group here in Ghent who is making performances for young people, and one of the actresses was performing a person who was, you know, living in a wheelchair. You know, she played a person in a wheelchair, and when they wanted to show this performance in England, the people who co-produced this performance came to tell the theater group that they couldn't do that any longer, because, you know, this person was not somebody who was living in a wheelchair. If you want to show somebody who is in a wheelchair, you should work with an actor who is living this situation, so you cannot perform this anymore. And that becomes very trivial,
Yeah.
because then you can think like, okay, if you cannot play another character anymore, that's an extreme example, but like for example, if you're not gay and you are playing a gay person, if you cannot do that anymore as an actor, then you question, of course, everything, or something very essential of acting. Because
Theater, yeah,
acting,
yeah.
it means that you can only play yourself at the end. So where is the limit, or where are the borders, and how can you respect this idea that people who are disabled and who are actors should be involved in performances? That's something very basic, I think, but at the same time also give the opportunity at actors or dancers that they play something else than themselves. Where are the limits and where are the borders? This is a discussion that is not finished yet, I think.
And you think, because now you're doing some, Gardenian, it's not a remake, but it's after some years you take it back. This piece, Wolf, would be something that you imagine to take back, for example?
I told myself I would never do a piece or perform a piece again, except when it's with the same people. Like, for example, Out of Context is one of these pieces that when it was finished, the dancers asked, can we still do it once a year? Not only in that, in this way we can meet each other again, because for some of them they're living very far away. It's a way to meet each other again, but also for these dancers it was something challenging in terms of it would be nice to see how we grow old in a piece. That's a good reason why a piece should be continued to perform, And the agreement is, if we have to replace people, then we stop. If somebody is getting ill or cannot do it anymore, then we should stop. That's a good reason, I think. Gardenia is another thing, because we are going to remake this performance 10 years after, but with the same cast also. And even one of the performers died, and we questioned, like, should we replace her? And we decided not to, and only perform with 9 instead of 10. There's only one time that I allowed myself to remake a piece, and that was Coeur. Because the question was, can you make Coeur again with the choir of the Opera of Flanders? But the challenge was also to recreate it with the people from the Corps de Ballet of the Opera of Flanders. And I have never worked with a Corps de Ballet, and that was a challenge for me. Now, when we remade it last year, I could see that we had a little bit time to also to rethink the material, the dance material, and to recreate certain things with the people of the ballet company. So in that sense it was challenging, but in general I would not do that too much. My idea is, if people want to recreate certain pieces that we made some time ago, I would prefer to give them the material, and that they recreate something based on the material, on the original material, which would mean that they could change also the contents and the music and the material based on what has existed. But if it would become something completely different, I wouldn't mind, So if people want to recreate pieces that I made a long time ago, they should feel completely free to reinterpret it. I wouldn't go for an exact copy of what we made in those days, because that's also the reason why I don't want to recreate it. I consider each piece that we made as a piece that was made by a certain kind of group of people and in a certain period, and that's why it's so difficult for me to remake it.
And how, in relation to this, how do you renew yourself, like, every time, and how you challenge yourself to go on, like, because in your work, every piece is very different one from another. Like you don't go in one line, let's say, of things. You always come with new things. There is something you do to keep going in that way.
Well, I remember the very first performance we made with three people, Stabat Mater. I had the impression that in this piece everything was there that I wanted to tell, and I was afraid I would never be able to make something new, because you know it was so much, so intense. But then I realized on the way on that that there is always another kind of trigger that makes you go on, and one of them was the fact that in the beginning I could not work with a fixed company, because you know we had no money, and then also the people I worked with were semi-professionals, and some people worked, or some people were just able to join us for one performance, and then they wanted to go in other companies, so I could not make a fixed company. It was for each performance more or less like a new cast, and that was enough for me to make a new performance, because you know the kind of information that these people bring into the studio is most of the time so different. So you have new material every time when you work with new people. That's what I believe. But also there is, when I look back, there are a few moments that I took the initiative to start something around a certain kind of idea, but most of the time I was invited to make something, and that triggered complete new worlds. Like for example, Wolf was an invitation of Gérard Mortier to work around the idea of what can opera mean nowadays, or how can you make something that will be presented in an opera, and that was completely new for me. But there were other triggers, like for example, Taubach was made because there was an actress who wanted to work together with dancers, and I never did this before. Or Gardenia, it was an invitation of Vanessa van Derlo, who is like one of the first transgender persons in Belgium, and who wanted to tell her story and the story of the people that she knew in those days. And she was talking about the first transgender and transsexual people in the 60s, 70s, 80s. So there is always another kind of trigger, another kind of idea that most of the times comes from outside of me. So I have a few ideas, but very little. But most of the time it's somebody who proposes something to me, and then I go, oh, maybe that's an interesting idea, and then I try to find people who would like to join this adventure. And in that sense, I wouldn't say I renew myself, but I continue to work around new ideas.
A lot of the people who are with you and the dancers talk a lot about the freedom they live when they work with you, and the special, like for many dancers or many people who were performing with you, it's very hard after to go to the world, let's say. How does it feel as a responsibility for you, or as a present you give, or as this kind of life you live in the creations? How do you experience it?
I think it's true that people, because my way of working is that I start from very few ideas when we start to work. Sometimes it's a composer, a certain kind of music, or the composer and a group of people, and the way they will meet each other, or a certain kind of theme, like for Gardenia this transsexuality, or for En Avant Marche a brass band, and how to work with them, or for Coup Fatal and Requiem pour Elle, working together with musicians from Africa. So it's that's the starting point, and then there is this long period where I think, but you have to correct me if I'm wrong, that I give a lot of freedom for the people. That we improvise a lot. I know that I feel like a scouts leader, you know, that an organizer, somebody who, you know, there's coffee in the morning and there are some of assignments and there is a certain kind of agenda.
Conditions also.
Yeah. And in this agenda, I think people feel that they can propose things. You know, if I organize improvisations around certain themes, that I know that people can propose also other themes, or they want. Sometimes they feel like, I would like to work with you. And, you know, so there is a long period of at least a month where I can feel that people feel quite free. You know, they bring in all sorts of information, films. Ideas for improvisation. Sometimes we go out of the studio to visit certain things. We invite people. So there is a lot of things happening in that in that first month. But what is important also is that people are. It can be seen as a certain kind of freedom, but it's also quite scary, I think, for people to be in this kind of situation because they have to propose a lot of things. And they can feel that if they do not propose something, that maybe they will not find their place in the end result, in the performance. So I think it's a mixture of feeling free, but also feeling very, feel a lot of pressure, you know, for doing that. And I can imagine if you enjoy this kind of atmosphere and this way of making things, that it must feel very awkward if in another company all of a sudden in front of you there is a director who in the morning tells you what to do and how to move, and no, it's not this way, but it's more this way. You know, I can imagine that this feels restrictive and that it can be disappointing, you know, after feeling this what you call freedom, but it's a creative freedom that you feel in the work that we do together. You know, you can propose anything, and I know that at a certain point I'm directive, but not from the beginning. It's more along the way and more towards the end. And if you get another working conditions where a director from the beginning is very clear of what he or she wants, then I can imagine that it's difficult to adapt to this kind of situation again. Not for all of them, because I've worked with people who, when they stopped working with me and they were in other kind of working conditions, they really liked a more directive way of working. So it's not
for everyone. Yeah.
No, it's not for everyone.
And it has to do also with some kind of trust when you give the trust that you give to the people that are there with you.
Yeah, but also vice versa. I mean, I can only be who I am because the people I work with give me so much trust. You know, they trust me a lot, and that's something that I can feel as a compliment, but also as a burden sometimes, because I feel like, oh, you know, did I do enough for everybody, or did I give everybody the right place in the performance? So it's tricky also from this perspective.
Yeah. And regarding like your life before as a psychopedagogue and this change you made in your life, you ever thought about it? I should have going that way, for example, like in your profession, or you know it when you started, you know it was this?
No. When because in the beginning it was really a hobby. We did some performances for fun with my sister, some friends, and so on. And since there was some public interest for what we were doing, we felt like, oh yeah, let's continue, let's make something else, and again and again. And at a certain point, I had to decide to stop the work I was doing, working in a cerebral palsy center, because otherwise I couldn't combine both. But when I took this decision, I knew it was a risk, and I wanted to try it for a while to see if it could work. And it's only because it was working that I just continued to do this. I remember in the first period when people asked me, because it was quite new in this performance world, that somebody who did not study theater or
Yeah.
dance all of a sudden became like a choreographer.
It's still
or
unusual,
director.
still today, I
It
find.
still is?
Yeah, it
Yeah.
still is, yeah.
But in those days, for sure, and people were asking me, what is the connection between your work as a remedial teacher, psychologue, orthopedagogue, or whatever you wanted to call it, and the theater that you were making? And I didn't want to make this connection because I couldn't explain. There was none. In my opinion, there was no connection. It was two different worlds. But it's only when I started to, after like 5-10 years, that I realized that this whole past that I lived in studying psychology and pedagogics, and the work that I did as a remedial teacher, in fact influenced very much the way I was looking at things, the way I was working with people. But it's something that I was aware of, I got aware of gradually. But it's only like in 2006 when we made Vespers, that for the first time I confronted the people I was working with this past by showing films of where I came from. When we watched the films of Arthur van Geheugden, this was this psychiater who filmed his patients in the beginning of last century. And when I confronted the dancers with these images, that I confronted them also with my past of working with people with disabilities. So it took me very long before I dared to confront the people I worked with my past, and that I told them that I wanted to use this kind of information literally, and I shared it. So before that, I'm sure it was there unconsciously, but I was quite embarrassed to really talk about that very clearly.
And this related with this fascination with the body, with dance, this all your past, you find this connection towards dance, for example? Or dance comes from another place?
I think, I have two masters, and one of them is Pina Bausch and the other one is Deligny. And Deligny is a pedagogue who taught me to watch carefully to people. He worked with people, with children who were autistic, and he didn't want to educate them or something like that. He just wanted to observe them very, very carefully to figure out what way he could find to communicate with them very precisely. Instead of using the language, to really look at how they were behaving, how they were trying to live their lives, and if there was some sort of a connection that he could make as an adult that went beyond the spoken language. So he observed them very, very carefully in the way they were physically, and how they behaved, and how they, this whole thing. And this inspired me very much in watching people, to observe them not only, or not to communicate with them only with the voice and with language, but how they were, and also the non-verbal communication. And for example, when we worked with deaf people in Wolf, that was quite important for me, because they taught me that even more, that that when you communicate with people, you're not only listening to their voice, you're observing them in their whole. The way they move, the way they use expressions in the face, the way they move their hands. So it's more than just the mouth that speaks. And I've always seen dance as the sum of all this. But also, Pina Bausch was one of the first who used this principle in working together with her dancers. She was not looking only in the way they could move, but the way they lived their lives, and everything they wanted to express, she used in the performance, you know. So it was not only the way they were making dances, but the way they thought and what they said about a certain thing. She was asking her dancers so many questions, and all of their answers could be information that she could use in the performance. And if that was singing or speaking or jumping around crazy or not moving or whatever, it might be an inspiration for her to nourish her performances. And in those days it was quite new, especially in the context of dance performances. So these two persons and the way they looked at people inspired me very much in seeing dance performances as more than just about making movements.
And regarding dance, you think there is future for dance as such?
I lived an interesting experience a few weeks ago with the students of a dance school in Antwerp, because, you know, something that I could feel not only today but since a long time regarding contemporary dance was the questioning of if dance was still something that could communicate with an audience. So more and more I could see very conceptual performances in which you were confronted with these questions of the dancers. You know, they were saying like, we don't know if dance, and especially beautiful dance, can still communicate nowadays. And it was something that I could feel also with these students. You know, they were, when I asked them, where do you come from and when did you start dancing and when did you decide to study dance? They all could tell me stories that were very beautiful. When they were children, they were dancing on the table, they were very inspired by Britney Spears, they were inspired by crump dance, house dance and stuff like that. And then they started, and that's the reason why they wanted to study dance, because they loved it and they did it and so on. But then when they started to study dance and when they started to see contemporary dance performances, they became more and more, you know, they questioned more and more these forms of dancing, you know, and so in some situations they became very even paralyzed, like I shouldn't move, or no, this has no sense or no meaning, and so on and so on. So I confronted them with this thing that I observed, and then I asked them to try to go back to their guilty feelings, their guilty pleasures about dancing. What did you really like about dancing, and can you use this material again to make performances with nowadays? And I confronted, or I asked them to use this material that was inspired by Britney Spears, by crump, by house and so on, to work with this material on Le Sacre du Printemps, which is, you know, a very difficult music. And I could see in a very short time that they started to enjoy moving again, and not only moving on this very difficult music with these, you know, with this memory of these old movements, I would say, but also that they liked to move together also with all this material on this very difficult music. And so I could see that they rediscovered the joy of dancing and moving again with this kind of assignment that I gave to them. And so that gave me a lot of hope in terms of, you know, it's not like this is a new perspective, because in fact we're using old material, old dance and old music, but put it in a new kind of combination, a surprising kind of combination. And the fact that they enjoyed it so much, and that they enjoyed moving so much again, and that they enjoyed moving together again gives me a lot of hope, and in that sense I believe there is still a lot of perspective in dance. But if you ask me like what form should it take, I have no idea. Of course, this is up to people to figure out and to invent.
From the point of view of the audience, you think like this kind of dance, what you just described, it's something that people will be happy to see, will be the audience?
I'm curious because you know when we worked on this performance for a very short time, only 2 weeks, I got at the end of it when we had something that we could call a performance, and when I saw it being performed by the cast, I got goosebumps. And for me, that's a very important sign. I've seen a lot in my life, but to get goosebumps on something that I see means that I cannot, you know, goosebumps you cannot control. You cannot make them. You know, either it happens or not. But it's a very, very powerful sign if this is happening. So when we felt it, because I was together with Bérangère also in the moment, and we felt the same. But we weren't sure if this was the feeling because, you know, in this short time and in the conditions of the COVID measurements that we had to respect, which was a very, very difficult situation to work together with the dancers with. You know, when we felt that, we weren't sure if it was the result of the difficult conditions we worked in and we achieved in 2 weeks this kind of result, or if this was just real, you know. And that's why we invited a few other people the next days to come and watch it together with us, and they felt the same. And if this is happening for an audience, it means it definitely has this kind of effect on an audience that you're talking about. But we never did it for a wider audience, it was just like a few people. And now, in a few weeks, they will present it in the school, and then later on in Dansant. And that will be like, that's when I will be able to say if it works for an audience. I think, but I'm not 100% sure. I want to see it.
And after you see all these dancers and this dancing, how does it feel like in your personal like within your body, like you are not the dancer?
No.
No.
No. I
Do you ever?
In the very beginning, when we made performances, I was part of them. But then we felt, because there was no director, we did everything and everybody decided about everything also. And then we felt at a certain point we need an external eye. And then I was pushed a bit in this kind of situation or this kind of position. And in the beginning it took me a long time to get used to be on that side. But gradually I kind of enjoyed it. And now I feel quite comfortable by that, because I was also supported by the people I worked with. They kind of gave me the feedback that I needed to grow in this kind of position. So in that sense, I feel really good, and I couldn't even imagine to be in the other position again, to be a performer. I think it's extremely courageous to come and to be a performer. It needs a lot of courage. I don't know if I would have this kind of courage nowadays. I can see it, for example, now with the people who recreate Gardenia. These are people, you know, most of them are like N60 and the oldest one is 78, and they are so exposed as personalities, but also physically. And I find it extremely touching to feel that they allow us to watch them in that way. And I don't know if I would like to be on this in this place, and if I would have the courage to be in this position. But at the same time, when I watch it, when I'm there, and there is also something very physical happening in me. It's not that I all of a sudden will start to move with them or something like that, but it gives so much.
You feel it in your body.
I can really feel it in my body. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And if you can say, or you want to say, like, what is your secret?
It's a very good question, Lizzie, because it's where I allow people also to come and watch the work to prove them that there is no secrets. There is no like secret weapon I have. I know what I can do. I'm able to create a safe space. This I think I can do. Maybe I grew in it, and maybe when I started to work like that, it was not so clear. But nowadays, I know when people come into the studio that they feel safe. They can do whatever they want to do. They can show whatever they want to show. They can be sure I will not abuse them in no way. I will encourage them to show as much as they want to share with me, but once they decide to, or once we decide to show certain images in which they are involved, I will check all the time if they are okay with that, if they feel comfortable in that. Even during the tour, I'm very often with them to check, and if they want to change or they don't want to do it anymore, there is always this openness and this possibility to change this kind of thing. So to install a safe space in which they feel confident that they will not be abused in no way, this is for me like very, very, very crucial. That's one thing. And the second thing is that I am never alone in taking decisions. The first people I engage in making decisions are the people I work with, the dancers. When they watch improvisations, when they watch each other, the kind of feedback that they give on what their colleagues are doing is for me is very crucial. I will never say alone that I really like this and I want it in the performance if I don't feel that this is supported by the group. It's not so exclusive what I'm saying, because it's something that it's a whole process. Sometimes you see things happening on stage that I don't like, that the others like, and then I want to see it again to be sure that maybe I can change my opinion about something. And the other way around, it can also happen that I like something and that there is a lot of questions that I can feel amongst the people, amongst the cast, and they might change because I am explaining what I'm seeing, I'm nourishing what I'm seeing. This kind of process is happening, I think, in a dialogue. And this is, if you can speak about a weapon, that's a weapon. The safe space, the confidence, the dialogue that I install with people in making a performance. These are maybe weapons that you can say, but I feel good if it's called like that. And then there is, I think, my specific tastes of things. I might surprise people because sometimes I can tell them that I like something very much, or that I'm touched by something, and that they are surprised because they didn't see that, or it's awkward that that somebody is saying, "Oh, this is beautiful," while you're thinking this is ugly. This kind of personal tastes, and this taste is nourished by the artists I like, by the images that I like, the films that I show. This kind of information comes into the process and might be something that is specifically linked to me as a person. These three elements are maybe my secrets, but they are not so secret because I think I am quite open about that in the process. I don't know. Do you agree on that?
Totally. No, you're very personal, so people feel they can open up themselves and discover something of themselves, like beyond. Of course, there is the work, but beyond, it goes even beyond. Like what I mentioned, like when we first met and I couldn't speak, and then then I spoke. Then I remember the first time I spoke. Like since then I speak. So it's a very this kind of experiences in the
Yeah.
studio bring you to the places you don't know. And
Yeah, I think
yeah.
these things are happening, and at the same time, I want to be careful when I say this because it's something that works for a number of people I work with, and for others it doesn't work. So it's not something that you know. If you talk about the secret, it's not something that works for everybody. You know, I met people during this whole adventure in time for whom it maybe was not a positive experience to work together with me. I have never had this kind of feedback, direct feedback. There's nobody who came to me and who said, "You're an asshole and I never want to work with you anymore." I've never heard this until now. But I'm sure that people, you know, have mixed feelings about working in these kind of conditions for different reasons. And some of them were able to communicate it with me, others were not. And it will remain a secret, or they will carry it with them as something that they have to digest themselves. This is so. It's not something I want to idealize.
Yeah, it's not only it can be confronting in a way that people cannot absorb.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting thing is, you know, because of this expo that we organized for a month, during this whole month, there were lots of people who came to visit this expo that I hadn't seen for a long time. People that worked here, not only as performers, but also people who were here as you know, technicians, or who did production work or tour management, or you know. And it was sometimes very touching to hear what kind of why they still appreciate the moment that they were here. There's something that they cherish very much, and that was very touching to hear. So people who were here for a short time and did other things in their lives still consider this as an important moment when they passed here, for most of the times very positive reasons. And that's something, if you hear that that's a present for me. It's really nice to hear.
And if you have to say something to people who would like to direct or become choreographers, you have a kind of an advice or something you like to say? Or you don't feel it's such a special thing to be, neither could be also?
No, I think if you want to become a director or a choreographer, it's a hell of a job to get there. You know, it's really, really tough to become one. It's something that eats you day and night. I mean, it doesn't. You cannot stop this thing. If you're serious about that, it's a life decision. It's not a professional decision. If you want to do this, it's really huge. But what I learned is, and it's something I learned gradually, because in the beginning I remember I felt like, okay, I have to show that I'm the director or the choreographer, what they say, whatever, and to remain confident that if you open up to the people you work with, and that you will receive a lot of input that comes from them. If you're confident about that, then it's a huge present. But of course, if you do that, it means that you have to work a lot, because you get so much information, and you have to really, as I said when I talked about Delaney, you have to be very careful in observing people. It's not just like, do you have a good idea? It's to try to figure out how this person feels at ease in giving information to you. That's also huge, you know, to this attitude, you know, that's huge, because it's not only with one person, it's with the 10 or 15 persons you're working with. So this is a lot of information. And it doesn't mean that you have to push them in being more and more extreme or something like that, because that can be also very dangerous if you want to do that. You know, it's this safe space, like, what do you want to give to me, and how much can I ask, or what can I ask from you? How can I provoke you in a good way, not in a way of show me more, but more like how much do you want to reveal of yourself? So this kind of game between you and the persons you're working with is that's it takes a lot of energy, but to be confident that people will do that, because that's the reason why they are there. People come to work, and the people who want to be on stage want to reveal themselves a lot, but sometimes they don't know how much and in what direction, so you can kind of help or support them in doing that. And sometimes you have to push, and then other times you have to pull back. I mean, this kind of game, or this kind of, it's not a game, it's a way of trying to live your life, in fact, with others. That's takes a lot of energy. So that's important. And then the other thing I learned also is not to censor yourself or the people you're working with, because sometimes you will be there, you will be confronted with very embarrassing situations for yourself and for the people you work with. But that's the safe space, you know. That really can happen in a studio. But it's tough and very difficult. I don't know if I'm clear in.
You are, yeah. So you try, to see what the person needs, to go into the person's life and what it needs and what.
Yeah. But
how to read it beyond, probably.
Yeah.
I mean.
But you can censor yourself. Like, for example, I will give you a good example. The duo that you created with Romeo, which is a very, very it's a very sexual thing, you know, without exposing in a way that, let's say it's a you know, when you started to work on this kind of scene, I felt very uncomfortable. And if I would have been very honest with what I feel, I would have stopped you. And I would say, like, I don't like that. I don't want to go there. But it would be something that, it would be, in fact, it would censor myself, not you, but censor me. Because you are showing, you were going into something that made me personally very uncomfortable, but you were comfortable in making this, and you wanted to express this. And the kind of feedback that was given to you by the people who watched it was very constructive and very positive. So if I would have been the real director, classical director, I would have said to you, I don't want this. But I didn't want to censor myself. So I said, like, Alain, maybe you have to look at this. And maybe you have to look at this in another way that you're used to. So I was pushing my personal boundaries in that way. And it was something that afterwards I felt so good about. So you kind of helped me in that way. And I think in that sense I learned to see my own taboos and learned to deal with that. And this is an extreme example, but another extreme example that came from me was when I worked on Requiem pour Elle, and I confronted myself, like, if you want to make a performance about death, how far do you dare to go? And what do you want to show? And from my personal experiences in living situations in which I saw people who died, I thought, like, I should show this to a broader audience, because, you know, it's not something you should be scared of. It should be something that we should embrace. But when I decided to show an image on stage of a person who is dying, that was the furthest. I think I could push my brain somewhere. But when I decided to do that, I was convinced that this would never succeed. I would never succeed to do that because there would be too many borders to transgress. You know, like I would never find a person who would allow me to film his or her death, or I could never convince the people I work with to use these images in a performance, or I could never convince a theater director to show this performance where this image was happening, or an audience would never accept us to show this. You know, they would leave the theater. So these were all obstacles that I was sure I would never get over. So I was confident I would never succeed in that. But then the opposite was happening. And you know, all these borders were crossed one by one. And at the end, we could show a performance in which we show a person who is literally dying every night, and the cast was feeling comfortable about that. The theaters invited us to show it, and the audience was very touched by that. So I didn't censor myself in that. If I would be very, you know, if I would have censored myself, I would never allow myself to do this and to show this. So as a director or a choreographer, a priori, you do not censor yourself, but you're very careful in how to make steps. That is maybe something, an advice I could give to people who start doing.
Like you always have to be aware of what you're doing, but
yeah, you should be very aware, because you know, when I tell you the story about the images that we used in Requiem pour Elle, you know, to arrive at this moment that we felt completely okay in presenting this performance. It took us 1.5 years of a daily questioning. You know, daily questioning: are we sure we want to do this? And do we not take decisions that go against certain ethics, you know,
or something you can regret after,
and that you can regret afterwards. Yeah. So it's 1 year of 1.5 years on every day, be confronted with questions. Can we do this? No, we can. Yes, we should. No, try not. Yeah.
But to see it like this, how it is presented, it gives you some peace of mind as well, because it's like a privilege also when you watch, no?
Yeah.
In this case,
at
like
the end,
you feel privileged, like you
absolutely.
As audience, I mean. Like.
But and not only that, you see, for me, this is like where, for me, it becomes so difficult to explain to people that in this kind of situation, you get also the privilege to grow as a human being. You know, that's why I feel very uncomfortable when people put me on a pedestal, you know, and they say like, oh, not Pascal. I feel like thanks to the people I work with, I can grow. I can not grow in fame, but grow as a human being, you know, and that's why I still like to do this job so much. And I think I will not stop until I feel I'm physically not able anymore, or mentally not able anymore. It's a way of living. I think if you're an artist, you cannot, and that's because I feel very embarrassed in using the word artist. But for me, it's like it stands for something, an attitude, a way of how you want to discover your life and the life of the people you work and live with. And that's something if you are aware of that, then you feel extremely privileged.
Thank you very much. You are the master.
See, that's what I'm afraid of.